All right, let's dive right into this explainer. When we look back at text written thousands of years ago, it is incredibly easy to just brush them off as simplistic or maybe even barbaric myths from this totally unorganized world. But today, we're going to completely reframe a specific 3,000-year-old text. We're stepping away from the idea of ancient folklore, and instead we're looking at it as a highly structured, fiercely transactional labor and liability code.
You might assume ancient society was just entirely lawless, right? Like it was completely lacking in anything even closely resembling worker rights or corporate liability. But the answer found in the source text we're examining today is unexpectedly meticulous. So, what actually happens when an ancient laborer gets severely injured on the job? Or what happens when an employer flat out breaches a contract? Well, the legal remedies might actually shock you.
To really wrap our heads around this, we're going to break the source text down systematically into 5 key areas. We'll hit ancient labor roles, the 6-year contract, rights of female laborers, workplace and bodily injury, and finally, property and ancient liability.
Okay, Section 1, Demystifying Ancient Labor Roles. Let's kick this off by totally busting a massive modern misconception about the very words we're reading here. A lot of English translations use the explicit heading, Laws About Slaves. And let's be honest, that immediately paints a very specific, often brutal picture in our modern minds. But if you look a little closer at the text, there's a crucial footnote that completely shifts our understanding of how this society actually functioned. What's genuinely fascinating is the definition of the original Hebrew word used here, ebed. This term actually designates a really broad range of social and economic roles. It reveals this complex spectrum of economic indentured servitude. So we aren't just talking about absolute chattel slavery. We're looking at laborers and servants who actually maintained very specific legally enforceable rights against their employers. Moving right along to Section 2, the 6-year labor contract. With that foundational understanding in place, let's look at the explicit transactional terms of a laborer's contract. So the standard term limit for a Hebrew worker entering service was definitely not some endless, inescapable black hole. A worker served for exactly 6 years. That's it. And in the 7th year, the law literally mandated that he was illegally entitled to walk away totally free, for absolutely nothing. It was a clean slate. If he came in single, he left single. If he came in married, his wife left with him. Just a perfectly defined 6-year contract. However, there was a really specific stipulation. If a master had provided the worker with a wife during his service and she bore him children, the wife and kids legally remained with the master when that man's 6 years were up. Obviously, this dynamic led to a pretty dramatic, legally binding declaration. If the worker wanted to stay with his family and his employer, he had to explicitly state, "I love my master, my wife, and my children. I will not go out free." The absolutely crucial point here is that opting into a lifetime contract wasn't just, a casual handshake. It required a formal, highly physical ritual. The master would bring the worker before God, take him to the door or doorpost, and physically pierce his ear through with an awl. This permanent physical mark finalized the agreement, meaning he was now a servant forever, entirely by his own choice. All right, Section 3, Rights of Female Laborers. The legal code then takes a pretty sharp pivot to mandate very specific, separate protections for female laborers, particularly daughters sold into service. The text actually notes right up front that a female servant shall not go out as the male slaves do. Now, you might think that means she had fewer rights, but it's actually the opposite. The text outlines incredibly strict protections to prevent her exploitation. For instance, if a female servant displeased a master who had originally designated her for himself, he had absolutely zero right to just sell her off to foreigners. Because he had broken faith with her, he was legally required to let her be redeemed. And get this. Let's look at what happened if the master took another wife. He was legally prohibited from reducing the first servant's food, her clothing, or her marital rights. These were non-negotiable mandatory provisions. And the penalty for the employer was massive. Failing to provide these 3 basic things immediately voided her contract. She was legally allowed to walk away free, for nothing, without paying a single dime. It's basically an ancient breach of contract clause that heavily favored the vulnerable worker. Seriously, imagine an HR policy that strict today. Now for Section 4, Workplace and Bodily Injury. Let's see how this ancient society actually compensated victims for bodily harm and lost wages. You have almost certainly heard the phrase eye for an eye before.
In this text, it pops up in cases of severe harm. Specifically, it uses the example of men fighting and striking a pregnant woman during their quarrel. If serious harm follows, the text lays out this famous cascade of exact, localized, retributive justice. Hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn. It was actually designed to ensure the punishment exactly matched but absolutely did not exceed the crime.
But check out how this applied to the employer-worker dynamic. If an employer struck a servant, male or female, and destroyed their eye or honestly even just knocked out a tooth, the law dictated immediate liberation. The servant had to be let go free. This was the mandatory compensation for a permanent injury. You break your worker's tooth, you lose your worker entirely, with zero financial recourse for you. We're literally looking at an early form of workers' compensation and medical liability here. The text mandates that if men quarrel and one is struck and becomes bedridden but ultimately survives and walks again, the striker isn't charged with murder, but he is held financially liable. The guilty party has to pay for the injured man's loss of time, so his lost wages, and must ensure he is thoroughly healed. He's basically paying his medical bills.
All right, our final section, number 5, property and ancient liability. We're going to look at how this society handled negligence through the really fascinating rules of the goring ox.
This perfectly illustrates ancient tort law. Think about it. If an ox randomly gores someone to death out of nowhere, the ox is destroyed, but the owner isn't held legally liable for the freak accident. But if that ox had a known history of goring in the past, and the owner was warned but still failed to keep it penned in, the penalties escalated drastically. The ox is stoned, and the negligent owner is literally put to death for his gross negligence, unless a massive ransom is imposed on his life.
The text also dives into what happens if this wildly negligent owner's ox gores a laborer. And these strict liability rules didn't just stop at dangerous animals. They applied to premise liability too. If a guy digs a pit and negligently forgets to cover it, and a donkey falls in, the owner of the pit has to make full financial restoration. Or, if one man's ox kills another's, they sell the live ox and split the price, sharing the loss equally. The sheer logic and fairness built right into this system is incredibly structured. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I have a real challenge for you. We have just traced a 3,000-year-old text that strictly enforces compensation for lost wages, exacts extreme penalties for gross negligence, and mandates immediate freedom for a breach of basic contract provisions. It really makes you reconsider just how sophisticated ancient societal regulations truly were. I mean, if they already had all this figured out millennia ago, how much of our modern legal framework is truly modern? Thanks for learning with me today, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.